Many of us youngsters have grown up in Western societies, liberal societies, but more importantly, mixed societies. Whether at school, college or university, the youth are free to mix and interact with each other. But what effect does this have on us? And as Muslims, where do the boundaries lie? Join me for real stories, real issues and real views. This is Real Talk. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show. Today we're going to be discussing an issue which is increasingly affecting young people. Now, mixing between guys and girls is something that sometimes can happen for very innocent reasons, but in some situations it can lead you to making some decisions that could affect the rest of your life. Choosing between friends, family and faith is not always easy, so that's what we'll be discussing here today. Now, to help discuss these issues, we've got an expert panel here today, which I'm just going to introduce for you. First of all, we have Maulana Azanif Saab, who is the missionary in charge for the South Midwest of USA. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome again to the show. It's nice to have you back.
Pleasure to be here.
Next, we have Maulana Jahangir Khan Saab. Welcome to the show. Who's a missionary and in charge of the French desk. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
And Dr. Aziz Hafiz Saab, who is the Naib Sadr for Khadam al-Ahmadiyya UK. Welcome to the show. Now, I want to go straight into the discussion here today. Azanif Saab, I want to start with you. We're living here in Western society, and this society sort of prides itself on the aspect of freedom. I just want to have your views on this so-called freedom that we experience here.
Freedom is a wonderful concept. We all love it, we appreciate it, and we benefit from it because it gives us the capacity to do certain things that we couldn't do in a restrictive society. So let's start up by admitting that freedom is a value, it's a good value.
Okay.
But then if you don't have a limit to that freedom, it could interfere with other benefits of life. And I think this is where the struggle is today. We're talking about where should that limit come into.
Okay, Jahangir Saab, what do you think this sense of freedom, what kind of impact does that have on actually family life?
Well, I mean, like Aziz Saab has just said, many people do say that your freedom ends where the freedom of the next person starts. You have to temper your freedom to do anything really by keeping in view what other people are going to think of it or how they're going to be affected by it. So everything you decide, every action you're going to make has to have that, you have to have that in mind while you're going to do that. That's very important. You can't just go around living your life, because this is the thing. These days you'll hear young people saying, that we've been taught that we're free, we can do anything we want with our lives, the sky's the limit. But actually it's not like that, and very soon they also realize it when they start letting their freedoms become something unrealistic, and then it hits back and they get hurt as well.
Okay. Dr. Saab, what's your view on living in this free Western society?
Freedom, again, in terms of how you interpret freedom, there's no such thing as a complete freedom. There's laws and rules and regulations governing that freedom. If you look at it from a practical day-to-day life, the traffic light system, red, amber, green, that curtails your freedom. The red light curtails your freedom to stop at that light, and if it didn't tell us to stop, traffic would be chaotic. And you can look in countries of the world where they don't have something that basic as a traffic light. So
it's this point of chaos. Are you saying that actually freedom and chaos can be linked?
If they're not governed properly, freedom you can't have an all-encompassing freedom. I mean, you ask a very general question and I give you a general answer in terms of whether your sort of social freedoms, practical freedoms, there needs to be some rules governing them. Okay. So I don't think there's such a thing as a complete freedom to do what you want, when you want, how you want.
Okay, all right, fair point. I want to move on to the Islamic viewpoint regarding freedom. I mean, we know as Muslims that within Islam there's separate rules for men and women, and there's definitely instructions in place regarding separation between genders. So Azanif Saab, could you shed some light on this? What are the actual Islamic instructions on this?
The basic point that comes to my mind is a verse of the Quran that refers to two bodies of water. One is sweet and one is salty. And we must maintain a barrier between the two. So think of it this way, you have your Pepsi on one side and your water on the other side.
Okay.
If they were now both in the glass, in two glasses, you put them in one vessel, the value of that Pepsi is reduced because they'll quickly merge into one. And what Islam is talking about is we must maintain this barrier because we're in a sweet, a good environment.
Right, right.
And God wants us to stay in that and keep the salty environment out of us. Because unless you like Chinese food, sweet and salty, it just won't be the proper taste,
Okay. So if that is the case, we as Muslims, we're trying to live in this Western society, and it's not easy. So how can we still stick to our Islamic principles while living in the West?
Well, you see that in the West as well, they do stick to those principles to some degree. For example, you'll have toilets for women on one side and toilets for men on the other. Right. So they are sticking to it to some degree. They also have separate changing rooms for men and women. They obviously do recognize that there are differences there. And we hear calls for separation of the sexes in many schools as well, where teachers themselves complain that, especially when they reach the teenage level of, life, that many boys are distracted and they're not concentrating on their studies. There are many things like that. I think in the West, we have to give them credit for some things. They are following a kind of segregation. What Islam is saying is that they're not following it enough. And so there's social short-circuiting going on there, and this is having devastating effects now.
Okay. All right, let me just turn to the audience because we've got a number of young people here in the audience today, and all of you live here in the West as well. So how does it actually affect you on a day-to-day life? Yeah, we've got a point here. Do you think there's perhaps too much freedom in society?
I just wanted to say with regards to like when you're going through that age of influence and how you can be firm with God. Basically, a lot of it comes down to your parents as well, how they brought you up, what they taught you as you're growing up. For example, if you got someone who knows that he's a Muslim, who knows like, okay, this is right and wrong, but he doesn't actually follow it. But you got another person who's got his parents who's backing him up and telling him, all right, look, this is what you believe in, this is this and that.
Parents are key, aren't they?
Yeah,
Something we discussed in other programs.
exactly.
Like within the family unit, it's your parents that really give you that foundation.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like parents, basically, they come into it very like since you reach the age of influence. If you don't have your parents telling you what's right and what's wrong, then it gets difficult.
That's true. One other point I'd like to pose to the panel. I mean, like you said, that you always have your parents within mind. I think there's a differentiation between different types of people. There's some people who are told by the parents what's right, but then they still want to rebel. And within your teenage years, rebellion is a big thing. You feel like you have to rebel against these laws. You don't want to be told what to do. And Dr. Sab, specifically for like teenagers, that sort of age group, when you are going through this rebellious stage, even if you do have good parents who are telling you what to do, you go through this phase of you want to rebel against it. So how can you get through that?
I would say it's a question of what you can interpret what rebellion means. You could rebel, and it could be a very serious rebellion, criminal acts, evil acts, etc. Or your teenage rebellion could be that instead of coming home at 10 o'clock, you've come home at 11 o'clock. So there is a wide variation in what you mean by the word rebellion. I would sort of take it back a stage, that it doesn't end up being a problem or such a problem at the teenage years if, as those early years as they are growing up, they've got those guidelines and that moral code and that moral compass, whether, as we believe, it comes from a faith, or for others that don't have a faith, if it comes from some set of rules and regulations and guidelines that have been given by their parents or guardians. I would say if that's in place, when that stage happens, you don't have such a significant issue of rebellion because there's something to look back upon. There's some training that's been given, allow them to deal with that.
Okay, fair enough. So Nifsab, I mean, we live in this society to a certain extent. We have to integrate and we have to go to school. Within education, there's mixed schools, you go to colleges. You have to integrate to a certain extent. So how do you go about that integration? Where are the boundaries within that?
The boundaries are going to be where we search out in our society those who are giving us positive influences. That's the key in Quran as well. You know, kunu ma'as sadiqeen. Keep a company that has a positive outlook and has a decent moral base as an influence. Once Hazrat Ahmad alayhi salam was asked by a student that I'm all of a sudden getting very atheistic thoughts, and I don't know why. He asked him one question. He said, where do you sit in your classroom? Whom do you sit near? And he said, there's this person in my classroom who is a confirmed atheist. I sit near him. He said, change your seat and you'll feel better.
But having said that, as youngsters, how do we know our friends are morally, righteous, or how can we actually analyze our own friends around us?
Truly. I mean, I think most people...
We're young ourselves, we're still developing that morality.
I have failed to see an inability of most people to recognize who is the good boy from the bad boy or the good girl from the bad girl. Going through all my years of schooling and life, you can always pick out from the crowd the delinquent behavior, the ones that are a little bit off the straight path. And in general, you try to avoid that. And then now it's the trial and error, right? I mean, going through life is trial and error. So we're not always going to make the right choices in the beginning, but through the course of the interchange and the experiences, we get to know, and then we should make the right choices based on our knowledge.
Okay. You have to know how to choose your friends,
right,
because you're in the mix. You have to try and find out, how they are. But one key, which method to find out, what you shouldn't be doing, because if you do that, you'll fall into the wrong crowd, which was given by Hazrat Khalifa Rabi once when we asked him that if you have children who are, young people who are about to go to university, what advice would you give them?
Right.
Now, we were thinking he was going to say, well, tell them to keep in touch with their mosque, tell them to say their prayers, but he didn't say that. He said, tell them, please do not start to smoke. He said, because if they start to smoke, that will lead them on to other things. Now, if you're in a crowd which is smoking, then you're with the wrong crowd. Like Aziz Saab said, you should know which are the wrong crowd. Right. Another way which you can tell immediately that you're with the wrong crowd is that if your friends are taking you away from God, if you feel that being with them makes you think about God less, makes you feel like less doing, like doing prayers, saying your prayers and all that, then they're the wrong friends. Anyone can feel that.
Okay. So that's friends, but what about specifically when you're working in groups, you're doing college work or something, you have to work with boys and girls as well, so how do you balance that out?
Well, then again, there are limits to observe. Then the etiquettes which have been taught by Islam will have to be applied. And I'm sure Aziz Saab would like to say something about that.
Yes, I think the key here is one of the incidents in the life of the Prophet where Hazrat Aisha, his own beloved spouse, was saying that a blind man has come into the home, and therefore there's no need for me to practice parda, to cover myself in front of him because he's blind. And the Holy Prophet didn't accept that. He said, well, you can see him, right?
Okay.
So the point here is that we have to then control our behaviors and keep them to a message. Our body's giving messages all the time, signals. So we have to make sure we're not signaling to the other party that my intention is more than just being a student right now. And if you find you're crossing over that line, going to that salty water, withdraw yourself, request a professor or teacher, please assign me a different partner, because without revealing this is affecting my desires for this woman or whatever, this is influencing me in an unwholesome way.
One thing that's associated with that, I just want to move back to the panel, is we've been told that whenever you're speaking to girls, you should lower your gaze. So, what are the specific guidelines on that? Is something you have to do practically, or is it something that should be interpreted maybe a bit more metaphorically? Because some people, for example, might actually find it disrespectful in some cultures. If you're talking to them, having eye contact is seen as a good thing, right? So in some cultures, they might actually find that maybe a bit disrespectful. You're talking to someone and the other person's looking down. So what's your guidance
perhaps
on
that
that?
has something to say, but I'm a very tall person.
Okay.
So you can see what I'm about to say. I had sometimes when I was working in the government offices with a colleague who was female, attempted to do this, to lower my gaze, and it made her step back because she thought I was looking down at her body, Right. So I had to be very careful that I better look at you in the eyes so you know I have no desire on anything else. Right. But the general point is that in the Western society, we cannot offend them by our values, and we have to be very careful that they don't get the sense of disrespect by our attempting to follow the Islamic practice. And the gaze should be only enough, if you ask me, if you have to look at a woman, to communicate. And then keep looking away as far as possible.